Hi everyone. The lesson is Objective-C, instance versus class methods. Then in part 1 we are talking about class methods. So these are the tools and the references we will be using for this lecture. You need to make sure you cover this prerequisite lesson, instance variables part 1. Before this, you can find the link to that in the description. In this session, we'll be discussing instance versus class methods, the difference between the two, and then we'll be practically doing class methods. As usual, we are going to do practical demonstrations. So let's create a project to start with. So let me create a new project. Okay, a new project. Make sure it's not iOS, it's macOS command line for this lecture. Click next, then give a name. Let's say example1. Make sure the language is, give me a second, project. So make sure you select, let's say example1, and then make sure the language is Objective-C and click next and give a meaningful location. Okay, so let's go into this class methods. Okay, class methods, let's create it here. So example1. Now for me to explain the difference between instance and class methods, let me say it this way. Now, as the name says, when you say class methods, in order to invoke the method, you can just use the class. You don't have to create a object. But instance methods, as the name says, in order to invoke a instance methods, you need to have an instance. Instance means object. So simply, class methods can be called without a object, just through the class. Instance methods has to be called through instances, right? That's one difference. Then there are other differences also. So let's start with the class method. Now let's take a suitable example for that. Let's create a class and let's call it as the calculator class, right? Calculator class. Make sure the language is Objective-C and create. Now in the calculator class, in the implementation, right, in the interface, let's create a method. Now when you are creating a method, if you start it with a minus, it's going to be instance method. If you start with a plus, it's going to be a class method. So I will put a plus, then you give a return type to the method, then you give the method name. Let's say add, for example, add method. Okay, great. Now then what I can do is, let's say I want to pass parameters. Let's do that as well. So to put a parameter, you will say okay, add method, right? Let's say let's give some parameters. Let's say width, just naming convention, width number 1, right? So then let's put a parameter of, say, int. Let's call it as number 1, and let's say and number 2, label, connecting label. Then let's put the parameter int number 2. Awesome. So now I declared a method with 2 parameters. So let's go to the implementation and let's implement that method here. Right. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to add the 2 numbers, and let's say I'm going to print it here. So int, let's say answer is equal to number 1 plus number 2, and let's print it. Let's say answer is equal to answer, and let's put the format specifier here. Okay, so I declared the method with 2 parameters. Then next thing is to call the method. So when you are calling a class method, you don't have to create an object. That is the theory, right? So you can straight away call it using the class. So to call a class method, first of all, you will import the class, right? Calculator.h, and then you will just pass the message to the class. So the class is calculator, right? So the class is calculator, so you will say calculator and then you will pass the message. So the message is the method. What's the method? Add with number 1 and number 2, right? So you will say add, see it comes automatically, right? You the method you declared. So let's say 10 and 5, right? Awesome. That's it. So if we run this, I should get the output. So this is straightforward, right? So this is how you call a class method. You see the answer is 15. So I can call it, if I want to call it again with two different numbers, the same concept, you just change the numbers. Let's say 40 and let's say 20. So if you run this, now it will add it with those two numbers over here. So it's simple. So when you use class methods, it's simple that you don't need to create a object. So just to experiment, let's create an instance and try to call this method. You don't have to do it, but let's say if you create an instance, right? Let's say you create object of calculator class C1, and on C1, if you try to call the method, you are getting error. It says no visible interface because add with number 1 is not a instance method. So you can't call it on a instance because you have declared it with a plus. It means it's a class method. So hope that's clear to you. But let's do an experiment. Let's say if I change this method, instead of plus, if I put hyphen, that means minus, and then if I in the implementation also if I put that, now this is a instance method. So now the difference is you will get the error vice versa. That means I should get error in these two lines, but this should work. For that, let's compile the project. So if I compile, now you can see this line works. Why? Because the add with number 1, I just change it to be a instance method, hyphen. So now, because it's not a class method, you are getting error over here. So now it's clear for you at this stage that to call a class method, you use the class. You don't need an instance. And if it's a class method, you can't call it with an instance. Then if it's an instance method, you can't call it using just the class. You need to create an instance. So hope that's clear to you, right? But let's put it now. The question: why do you which one is better for? Is it a instance method or a class method? Now the difference is this. Now if it's an instance method, you have to create an object, right? And then sometimes depending on the situation, you might even create multiple objects, right? I'm just giving example. You might even create multiple objects, not always, but I'm just giving example. So when you create an instance or even multiple instances, it allocates memory, so it consumes memory. So which means if you are calling instance methods, because you are creating an instance, an object, it allocates memory. It requires extra memory. So that means compared to instance methods, if you have class methods, because you are not required to create instances, you are saving some memory. So in that sense, whenever possible, it's good to use class methods because you can just straight away call it on the class and it saves some memory because you don't have to allocate or create in multiple instances. You can just use the single one class and call the method multiple times. So hope it's clear to you. So whenever you use class methods, the advantage is it consumes less memory. Right. So because of that, then it's better to make it a class method so that I don't have to create objects, so that I can save memory. Right. So I don't have to do this. Right. So let's comment this and let's say that you can't do this because of class methods. Right. So let's put a comment here and say, so I put a comment and said you can't call the following method using instances, meaning objects, because it is a class method, because it's a class method. you can't do it, so you can straight away call and it saves some memory. So whenever possible, try to use, if possible, try to use class methods. Okay, awesome. So now you know the difference between class methods and instance methods. The difference is it saves memory. So whenever possible, use class methods. Now the question is, can you use class methods always instead of instance methods? So for that, let's look at the next lesson. To answer that question, let's have a look at the next lesson. But let's complete this lesson and move to the next lesson. So we did a practical demonstration, and now you know the difference between the two types of method, instance versus class. Then we did a practical on class methods. You can find the link to download the source code in the description. We use okay, in this lesson we didn't use developer docs or APIs. That we'll be doing in future lessons. So look at the next part to complete this topic and have a look at our other video. So we are very excited to see you in the next lesson to see whether we can use class methods always and why we need instance methods. See you in our next lesson.